Dr. Voss, can you hear us?
I don't know what we found, or what found us.
It's not me.
You left us, but we're hungry.
You could have been something more.
The ship shuddered as it approached Orbital Research Station Theta 9, its rusted hull a wound in the darkness. Dr. Kieran Voss stood at the viewport, staring at the derelict station drifting on the edge of the known universe. The place had been abandoned for nearly a decade, though no one truly knew why. Reports from the last surviving crew had been redacted, sealed away in government archives. What little information had leaked suggested something had been found. Something buried deep within the asteroid Theta 9 had been built to study. Kieran wasn't here for rumors. He was here for the truth. Docking sequence engaged. The ship's pilot, Lieutenant Julian Carter, muttered through the intercom. The clamps engaged with a hollow clang, and the ship let out a slow, dying wheeze as its engines powered down. The lights inside the station flickered as Kieran and his team stepped through the airlock. The scent of rot and stale air clung to the metal walls, and an eerie stillness pressed against them. No signs of life. No bodies. Just the husk of a forgotten outpost, left to decay in the void. Kieran's heart pounded as he followed the map on his wrist display. The excavation site was beneath the station, cut deep into the rock of the asteroid itself. The corridors grew tighter, the temperature colder as they descended. Shadows stretched unnaturally in the dim emergency lighting. The chamber lay at the lowest level of the station, a cavern carved from obsidian stone, and at its heart stood the monolith. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, a structure of sheer, impossible geometry, black but not merely black, a void in space itself. It pulsed faintly in a rhythm that made his breath hitch in his throat, though he couldn't say why. "Christ," muttered Ren Ishikawa, the ship's biologist. "It's alive." No one spoke. The monolith pulsed again. Kieran stepped forward, drawn to it as if pulled by something beyond his control. He barely registered Carter shouting his name, barely heard the frantic footsteps behind him. His fingertips grazed the surface, and time shattered. A scream rang through his skull, though he couldn't tell if it was his own or something else's. He was everywhere, in every moment at once. The station was alive around him, filled with figures in strange, flowing uniforms. Their faces were wrong, stretched impossibly thin, their mouths opening too wide as they chanted in a language older than human thought. Kieran saw himself, but not as he was, twisted, deformed, his limbs elongated, his face half melted into something grotesque. Then the vision changed. It saw him. A presence loomed behind the monolith, something too vast to comprehend. Not a god, not a demon. A hunger that existed outside time itself. It did not speak in words. It spoke in concepts, in unbearable truths that cracked his mind. Serve. The word wasn't spoken, it became him. It flooded his brain, filled his veins, dug into his very cells. He felt himself unraveling. His past, his future, his body, all things undone and remade in its image. He gasped, wrenching himself free, falling to the cold stone floor. The station was silent once more. His team stood above him, their faces pale, eyes wide with horror. "Kieran," Ren whispered, "what happened to your hand?" He looked down. His skin had changed. It rippled, faintly, in time with the pulse of the monolith. And deep in his mind, something laughed. Kieran lay in his bunk, staring at his hand. The skin had settled into something almost normal. Almost. If he held it under the harsh white lights of the station, it looked like it had before. The veins resting beneath the surface like delicate blue threads. But when the light dimmed, when the shadows stretched, something inside moved. His fingers twitched, but not from his own command. A ripple passed under his flesh, like muscle and tendon shifting in slow waves, adapting, becoming something else. The first night after the monolith, he dreamed of himself, but not as he was. The Kieran in his dream stood just slightly out of sync, like a recording played a fraction of a second too late. His movements blurred, his limbs elongated, his mouth twisted open as if trying to scream. But no sound came. He woke drenched in sweat, the scent of ozone and blood thick in the air. Theta 9 had grown colder since the excavation. The station had always been in the outer reaches, where the light of distant stars barely touched it, but this was different. The walls seemed to leach warmth. The air had a metallic taste, sharp and bitter on his tongue. The others noticed it too. "We need to leave," Carter muttered as they gathered in the common room, his voice low, tight. "Whatever we woke up down there, it's not meant to be touched." Ren shot Kieran a glance. He had seen the way she had been watching him, not like a friend, but like a scientist studying a specimen she didn't trust. "I agree," she said carefully. "But before we do, I need to run some tests." Silence. Kieran's stomach twisted. "On what?" Ren's eyes didn't leave his. "On you." It took everything in him not to react, not to clench his fists, not to shift in his seat, because he knew that whatever had taken root inside him, whatever had stretched its fingers into his flesh, would react with him. So he nodded. "Fine." The medical bay was sterile, the only room in the station that hadn't yet succumbed to dust and decay. Ren worked in silence, drawing samples, scanning his body under the cold hum of the bioscanner. Kieran stared at the ceiling, willing himself to stay still, willing his own skin to behave. Then Ren inhaled sharply. "What is it?" he asked, though he already knew. She didn't answer at first, just turned the display toward him. Kieran's breath hitched. It was a scan of his blood, magnified 100 times over. The cells should have been uniform, red, human. They weren't. His blood moved on its own, strands of shifting biological data, writhing and splitting apart like something alive. His DNA was unraveling, recombining, changing. "This isn't natural," Ren whispered. The scanner beeped, the screen flickered. Then, for just a second, Kieran's reflection in the glass showed something that wasn't human at all. He flinched back. When he looked again, it was gone. Ren shut off the screen. "We need to leave," she repeated, But this time her voice held something else. Fear. That night, Kieran woke up gasping. Something was crawling under his skin. He lurched out of bed, fumbling toward the nearest reflective surface, a monitor screen, dark and glossy. His breath came ragged as he pulled up the sleeve of his shirt. The veins beneath his skin had turned black. Not just black, moving. They pulsed in rhythmic spirals, shifting beneath his flesh like something alive. His fingers trembled as he reached toward them, his breath shallow, his mind screaming at him not to touch it. But he did. His skin rippled. Not like a shudder, not like a normal involuntary reaction. It pulled away from his touch. His own flesh recoiled. Kieran staggered back, his stomach twisting, bile rising in his throat. He clamped his hand over his mouth, suppressing a scream. And then, from somewhere beyond the walls of Theta 9, deep in the veins of time itself, something watched. Kieran no longer dreamed of his past. The station's dim corridors had grown unfamiliar, warped by the silent thing coiled inside his flesh. He could still move, still breathe, still speak. But each time he did, he felt a second presence lurking just behind his actions, as if his body belonged to something else now, something half-formed, waiting. Time did not feel real anymore. He would enter the research wing and see versions of himself already there, flickering like half-finished sketches in the periphery of his vision. When he turned to face them, they vanished, like echoes of a life already rewritten. Then came the gaps. One moment he was in the mess hall, staring at the untouched tray of food before him. The next, he was standing in a different corridor, his hands slick with something warm and wet. A sharp, copper scent filled his nose. Blood, not his. A sound, a whimper, came from behind him. Wren. She was on the floor, propped against the wall, her face pale, her breathing shallow. A deep gash marred her side, her uniform dark with spreading crimson. Kieran staggered back. What? His voice was hoarse, raw. Wren's eyes flickered up to him, full of terror. "Kieran," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's not you." His stomach lurched. "What do you mean?" She coughed, wincing, her breath ragged. "I saw you, but it wasn't you. It moved like you, spoke like you, but its face." She squeezed her eyes shut, a shudder running through her. It was shifting, like it couldn't decide which version to wear. His pulse pounded in his ears. There was another him aboard the station. Kieran lurched away, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He turned a corner, gripping the rusted walls of Theta 9, his fingers pressing into the metal so hard it should have hurt. But it didn't. His nerves were going numb. His veins pulsed, thick and black beneath his skin. They no longer followed the normal paths of human anatomy. They coiled, spiraled, forming grotesque patterns of impossible geometry. And then, something answered. Not with words, not with sound, but with a presence. Kieran felt it before he saw it. A shadow flickered at the end of the corridor. No, not a shadow, a shape, a reflection without a source. It moved like him, but not quite, its limbs stretching too far before snapping back into place. Its face was blurred, like a smear of static rearranging itself with every second. It was wearing his future selves. Every time he had jumped through time, every version of himself he had abandoned, they had not disappeared. They had been consumed. And now the thing was no longer just watching. It was hunting. Kieran ran. He had no destination, no plan, just the raw animal instinct to get away. The station twisted around him, corridors repeating, walls breathing, the emergency lights flickering out of sync with reality. He turned a corner and slammed into himself. Not the blurred thing, not the predator, him. A second Kieran stood there, panting, wild-eyed, his face smeared with sweat. He knew this wasn't a trick. This was a real version of himself. One from some past or some future, but still human. The other Kieran grabbed his arm, his grip painfully tight. "You have to stop," the second Kieran rasped, his voice raw with desperation. "It's inside us. It's been inside us since the moment we touched the monolith." Kieran tried to speak, but the second version of himself convulsed. His veins bulged, black spirals writhing beneath his skin. His jaw unhinged with a sickening crack, his eyes melting down his face like ink running from a dying pen. His bones twisted, his skin split. The thing crawled out of him, shedding its stolen flesh like a cocoon, stretching its true form into the dim, flickering light. It was not human. It had never been human. It had only worn humanity like a suit, using Kieran's stolen timelines as its hunting grounds, growing fat on every discarded version of him. And now, it was whole. Kieran screamed as the predator unfolded toward him, its body shifting between every version of himself he had ever been, every path he had never taken, every mutation he had yet to endure. It was him, and it was starving. Kieran ran, but there was nowhere left to go. The station was collapsing around him, not in any physical sense, but in time itself. Corridors stretched too long, then snapped back too short. Doors led to rooms that never existed. Shadows bent in impossible directions, as if the walls themselves were suffocating under the weight of something too large to exist. The thing behind him moved without moving. It was everywhere at once, flickering in the edges of his vision, whispering in the gaps between seconds. He could hear it inside his own head, shifting through the pieces of time it had stolen from him, wearing his discarded selves like flesh. The thing had no fixed shape, no singular form. It was Kieran. And it wasn't. He reached the control room, slamming the door behind him. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body shaking, his skin crawling. He could feel it now, his cells unraveling, his body rejecting the boundaries of time. His left hand trembled. The fingers lengthened and shortened at random, twisting through a dozen forms they were never meant to take. His veins coiled in fractal spirals, shifting beneath his flesh like roots, digging deeper into something rotten. He let out a sharp breath. This was it. There was no undoing it, no fixing it. The moment he had touched the monolith, he had been claimed. The predator had always been here, lurking in the currents of time, waiting for something like him, a traveler, someone foolish enough to open a door that should have remained shut. And now, it wanted more. Kieran stumbled toward the control panel. His fingers twitched, convulsing out of sync with his own thoughts, but he forced them to move. A single command blinked on the screen. Initiate temporal jump. Yes, he whispered. but not back, not forward. Further, he would go to the end, to the very last point where time still existed. If the thing inside him fed on his discarded selves, on the echoes of his timeline, then he would take it to a place where there was nothing left to feed on. The station trembled as the reactor powered up. The lights flickered, the metal groaned, the air grew thick with something unseen. Behind him, the door melted away. It stepped through. The thing that had been Kieran. The thing that had been so many Kierans before. It no longer pretended to wear his face. Its form rippled, flickering between what he had been, what he had never been, what he was becoming. Eyes too many, too few. Mouths whispering in voices that were his but not. Hands too long, too broken, reaching. Kieran hit the final command. The universe screamed. The station vanished in an explosion of unmaking, hurling him forward, faster than anything should be able to move. He saw time collapse. Stars eroded into dust. Galaxies burned themselves empty, the last traces of reality shriveling into frozen silence. And then, nothing. No time, no space, just the cold, endless void of the end. The hunger inside him twisted, realizing too late that it had followed him into a graveyard with no bodies. It shrieked, its form writhing, starving. Kieran felt his body fracture, his existence breaking apart, his flesh sloughing away into non-existence. The last thing he saw was his own reflection in the dark. A man, a monster, a god of nothing. Then, finally, silence. No future, no past, just the end. And there would be no one left to follow.